temperature sensitive, which was done by Minza Stiver at the University of Washington many years ago, and Peter Grutis. And it is a record that goes back hundreds of thousands of years, and you can take various bits and pieces of it, something like 20,000 measurements. So the data then, when you plot it out, shows that, and I'm looking at one of these curves now, for the past 500 years, there have been 40 periods of warming and cooling, none of which could have been caused by changes in CO2, because these changes took place long before there was any significant rise in atmospheric CO2. So you can't ascribe these to CO2 as a causative factor. And then if you go back longer than that, go back 15,000 years, the list of warming and cooling gets even longer and more intensive. For example, at the period from about 10,000 to 15,000 years ago, we know now that there were fantastic changes in climate. The past century is now probably about 1 degree warmer now than it was at the beginning of this century, which was incidentally a cool period. And so the total changes that have occurred in that 10,000, 15,000 year period amount to something like, in one case, 8 degrees centigrade, which is more than 10 degrees Fahrenheit, in 40 years. And the magnitude for some of these changes is like 20 to 25 times the magnitude of the rather small warming that we've experienced in the last century. And even in the last century, half of the warming that we have observed and been measured by recording stations, half of that occurred before the big increase in CO2, which began after World War II, and CO2 emissions began to soar. So we have all of these huge swings of temperature, global temperatures, without any possibility that it could be related to CO2 as a cause. And then if we look at the pattern, for example, the pattern over the last 500 years, shows that there have been 40 changes in the last 500 years, warm, cool. And the average of these changes, the average length of these changes turns out to be 27 years. Plus or minus the number, it varies from about 25 to 30 years, which happens to be the same amount of change that we've experienced in the past century. We've had 2 periods of global warming, 2 periods of global cooling in the past century. But if you listen to the news, you'll get the impression that, climate has never changed until the last 30 years or so when we had a warming trend. And that's just not the case at all.
So you're looking at everything in the context of cycles and not that there's this long-standing condition called global warming, correct?
That's correct. The hockey stick trick was a scientific fraud, and there were 3,000 papers that were published contrary to that conclusion, which is the main IPCC basis for their saying that CO2 is the cause of climate changes. And when we look at the data for long periods of time, we can see that the Earth's climate has been warming and cooling for centuries and millennia, with no possible effect from CO2. And then if we look at the pattern, we ask the question: if you look at the past history of climate changes, and see if there is a pattern, and there is a very definite pattern. There seems to be a switch from warm to cool about every 25 to 30 years or so, and you project that into the future. This is where the past is the key to the future. Then what we see is we're right where we would expect to be in that pattern.
And where are we now, Don?
We are in a period of cooling, or certainly a period of no warming, no significant warming. Since 1998, 1998 was the second warmest year of the past century, and you will see headlines. Matter of fact, there's a headline in the New York Times today that said that 2010 was the warmest year on record.
Absolutely not.
And,
oh my God!
And the joke about that, of course, is that it's based on manipulation of data again, and it's based on temperature records that are known to be biased, in some cases heavily biased. So the attempt to get some kind of an objective view is best done by looking at the University of Alabama satellite data, which shows that in fact the 1998 temperature was actually about a tenth of a degree warmer than the maximum temperature in 2010. So 2010 is not the warmest year of since 1979, when records first started accumulated by satellites. So you'll see headlines all the time about how this year or that year or this decade or that decade is the warmest ever. And then looking at a longer time period and asking the question, well, how significant is this? And it turns out that almost all of the last 10,000 years has actually been warmer than it is during the past century. So there's no correlation between geologic history and the claims that are being made for heating all the time. And of course, the biggest joke of all is the statements that are being made right now that global cooling is being caused by global warming, and the hotter it gets, the colder it's going to be. That's how they're explaining the incredibly cold winters that we're having in Europe and Asia.
It reminds me of the explanation for why all these birds have dropped to the ground dead. They said, they had bad digestion. It's about as crazy as that. Everything is global warming. Everything is, they had bad digestion, why hundreds and thousands of fish are dying. Interesting explanations. But here's my question to you. What is happening in Greenland with the ice sheets? And how come they're saying the ice sheets are breaking up? And how do you respond to that?
Easily. The data speaks for itself, and there are many, many claims that are being made, both in the press and by scientists who want to know better. And there are three areas of concern. One is the Arctic, the other is Greenland, and the other is the Antarctic. And so if we take those one by one, in the Arctic there is no ice sheet. It's an ocean. And so the only ice that's at the Arctic is floating ice, which is frozen sea ice. It's only a meter or two thick. And the claims have been made that sea level is going to rise 20 feet if the so-called Arctic ice cap melts. Well, A, there is no ice cap there, and B, it's floating, so if it melted, it wouldn't affect sea level at all anyway. And so the records are kind of scarce up in the Arctic and the North Pole area. There are better temperature records available for Greenland. So looking at Greenland, there has been melting of Greenland glaciers for about the last 30 years, something like that, no doubt about it. But the question is that unusual? And does it have any relation to CO2? And the answer is no, because there are records kept in various Greenland weather stations that date back to about 1900. We have a 100-year record. And each of those shows that there was a cold period from about 1880 to 1910, something like 1915. And then temperatures rose, reaching a high in the 1930s. And temperatures were actually higher in Greenland in the 1930s than they are right now. And the rate of warming from 1915 to about 1940-something, that rate of warming was greater than it has been over the past 30 years. So we're not quite yet to where we were in the 1930s. And then it cooled in Greenland from about 1945 to about 1980, roughly 1977. So the point here is that the glaciers in Greenland melt and advance in response to climate change, and the climate change is unequivocal for the past century in Greenland. It shows warming from the turn of the century to about 1940, cooling from then to about 1980, and then warming again. And it is exactly following the global temperature record and the temperature in glaciers all over the world. So there's nothing unusual about it. Now, as temperatures are cooling off, what we would expect to see is that we will soon see the glaciers beginning to advance rather than melt in Greenland. And the idea that you could melt the entire Greenland ice sheet is total nonsense. It would take a long period of time and with much more intense kinds of warming than we're seeing. So the third part of this picture is the Antarctic. And there have been claims that the Antarctic ice sheet is melting at an accelerating rate, and it's